In this video, we're going to take a look at how to build a pivot table, and we're going to just look at one example of how this can be useful, but this is really one of the most powerful tools that I've experienced in Excel. It can be used in many different ways and has many different applications. So to create a pivot table, you first need to select all the data that you want to include in this pivot table. So I'm going to select my entire transaction list. You can see everything has been nicely selected there. And then you're going to go to Insert. So we're going to click on Insert, and you'll see there is an option Pivot Table over here. So I'm going to click on Pivot Table. It's going to ask me if I'm happy with my data selection. At this point, you can change the data selection as well if you would like. It's then going to ask you where you want to put this pivot table. So do you want to put it in a new worksheet, which means it will create a new tab with this pivot table, or you can choose to put it in the existing worksheet, and there you'll need to tell where it should be included. So if I click there, the pivot table would be included over there. I'm going to just select a new worksheet and then click OK. And then it will take you to this view here in this new worksheet where you need to build out the pivot table. So on the right here, you'll see you have all the headings. So these would be all the headings you had on the first row of each of the columns that you selected. So it's important to make sure that your table does have headings. And then we can go choose what we want to be the rows in this table, the values, the columns, and if we want any filters. So I have a transaction list and I perhaps want to see the value per account. So I'm going to click here and drag accounts to rows. And now you'll see it'll populate all the accounts I have as rows. I then maybe want to see the value per row. So I want the values in columns. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to find debit and I'm going to drag it to values. I'm then going to put credit and also drag it to values. And now I've gone and added these two columns with that specific value. And it's noted that the values are the columns. Something that's important to check before we continue is whether it's gone and counted or added up these values. So to do that, we're going to come down here and we're going to click on this I, and it will take you to this view, and you'll see that the sum is grayed out. So in this case, it's adding up all the debits that have been put in that account, but it couldn't instead be counting them. So if it was count, we'll click here and you'll see that that looks much smaller because it's just counting the number of transactions. So if you wanted to see the number of transactions that were debited within accounts payable, then you'd have count, but we actually want the sum. So we're going to go back and change that to sum. You'll note you have various different options here. You could look at the average or max instead so that you can customize your pivot table. I'm going to click OK and you'll see that it's added up. I'm then going to go and format these numbers so it's a bit easier to see. So I'm going to go put that in there. And now I have a pivot table that shows me the debits and credits within each account. So I basically have turned my transaction list into a trial balance. We could add filters. So perhaps we wanted to go filter by source. We could drag source over here. And now you'll note that there's this little drop down here. And I could go and filter for only transactions that had payable payments. And now we'll have all the transactions that had a source payable payments and we'll be able to see how much occurred in each account. You'll note when I click away from the table, this disappears here. So if I click there, it's gone. But if I click there, it will appear again. And we can edit things. So perhaps we want to add our date as well as a row. We can come drag it to a row. And now you'll see it has grouped it per month. So we can go see how many transactions happened in each of these accounts per month. Okay, so you can play around with what you need. And the best thing is just to make sure you've selected all your data and then see where it makes more sense to put these different fields in your pivot table. I'm just going to remove my date. So to remove something, you just drag it and drop it back over here. And now I'm going to have to drag and drop my months as well. And now we're back to this equation. I'm going to get rid of this filter. And now we're back to this pivot table. I'm going to also get rid of my source filter. And now I've got back to this pivot table, which is in effect a trial balance. If I wanted to actually see net, I could go and sum that minus that, but you'll see it links it to the pivot table. So it's not going to be easy to copy and paste this formula down here. You'll note it gives you exactly the same value. So the best thing to do is to go back to the initial data over here and to add a net column here. So let's add net and we're going to go debit. I'm going to go equals debit minus credit. And then we're going to populate this all the way down. But now that's not going to pull through to my pivot because it wasn't selected. So what we can do here is come click here and you'll see there's this pivot table analysis. And pivot design. So if we click on pivot table analysis, you'll see we have this change data source option. So if we click on that, this will appear again and we can change the selection. So now we're going to include that net column, go all the way to the bottom, make sure all the data is selected and click OK. And now when we come back to our pivot table over here, you'll see that this new field net is now available. And so I can drag that into the values column as well, so I can see the net impact per account. So this is really useful if you're dealing with lots of different types of data. For example, financial information like transactions or accounts. We could group these per their classification, so perhaps current or non-current assets, if we had that information included in a column. So I hope that you understand the basics of how to set up a pivot. Remember, it's important that you select all the data that you would like to have in your pivot. It's also important that each column has a heading, because that's what you're going to use to build out this pivot. And then you can play around with what makes the most sense and decide what you want in your columns, rows, what you want to be the values, and if you want to add any filters.